When we first saw the city, it looked almost peaceful. Smoke rose in thin threads against a pale autumn sky, the sun glinting off the wide Volga beyond. I remember thinking this was the edge of victory. We had come so far from the fields of Poland through the endless steppe of Russia, chasing the dream that had been whispered to us since our first day in uniform. The war would end in the East, and we would be the ones to end it. I was 19 then, serving in the 6th Army. We were proud, hungry, and already half ghosts from the marches. Dust clung to our boots and to our throats. Every time we coughed, it felt like a reminder that we were far from home. Yet, when our captain gathered us around that morning and said Stalingrad will fall before winter, we believed him. We all did. We believed because we had to. The road into the city was lined with the wreckage of what used to be other men's victories. Burned out tanks, twisted trucks, a horse cart overturned and blackened from an airstrike. The air reeked of oil and something metallic, something that clung to the tongue, but none of that mattered. The city was close enough to see now Stalingrad, the prize of the Führer himself. We joked that once it was taken, we would finally go home. That night, I wrote a letter to my mother. I told her the war was almost won. I even promised her I'd be back for Christmas. I still see her face when I think of that lie. The first days of fighting were like nothing I'd known. The Russians didn't fight like men who had lost. They fought like the city itself was part of them. Every street, every cellar, every window. You could shoot a man from 10 meters and still not know where his comrade was hiding. The air was never silent. Machine guns stitched through the ruins. Mortar coughed from somewhere unseen. We learned to crawl, to breathe dust, to become shadows. At night, we slept in the basements of ruined buildings. The walls shook from artillery, and sometimes the dust would fall from the ceiling like snow. We'd joke about it, call it Stalingrad snow. I remember one night, Muller, the youngest in our unit, pulled out a crumpled photo of his wife and child. He said he kept it close because it reminded him why we were here, to make sure they never see this. I nodded, pretending I believed it too. The days stretched on. We gained a few streets, lost them again the next day. The Russians were always there, behind the next wall, under the next floor. The city became a maze of death. Our rations ran thin. The bread was gray, the water brown. Still, orders came. Hold your positions. Victory is near. One morning, we were told we'd finally reached the Volga, the heart of the city. I remember feeling something almost like joy. We advanced through shattered factories, past bodies frozen in grotesque shapes. The air was sharp, the ground slick with frost. Then the snipers came. They picked us off, one by one. You couldn't see them, only the echo of the shot, and the man beside you, falling. Muller died that day. The photo fell from his hand, landing in the snow. I picked it up and put it in my coat pocket. I told myself I'd send it to his family when I got home. I never did. That night, I didn't sleep. I just stared at the dark, listening to the groans of the wounded. Somewhere far off, a Russian loudspeaker played music, a woman's voice, soft, sad, drifting across the ruins. I didn't understand the words, but somehow they made my chest tighten. It sounded like home. By then, the word victory had started to feel strange on my tongue. The first snow fell in November. At first, it was almost beautiful, soft flakes settling over the ruins, covering the dead, softening the jagged edges of the city. For a moment, It made everything seem quiet, peaceful even. Soon the beauty froze into cruelty. The wind turned sharp, biting through our uniforms, and the snow stopped being white. Brown with ash, brown with blood. We weren't prepared for the winter. None of us were. Our summer uniforms clung to our bodies like rags. Some men wrapped themselves in newspapers or curtains torn from bombed apartments. We burned furniture for warmth. The city smelled of smoke, rot, and desperation. Every morning, we'd scrape frost off our rifles, praying they'd still fire. The cold jammed everything, weapons, trucks, even our fingers. We'd rub our hands until the skin cracked and the blood froze in seconds. Our boots were stiff, our feet numb. Frostbite crept up from our toes like death we couldn't feel. Food became a rumor. Our rations were cut again and again until we were living on bread made with sawdust. Soup was nothing more than melted snow and whatever we could find. Sometimes a rat, sometimes a horse that had frozen to death in the street. We ate without looking at each other. No one wanted to see the shame in another man's eyes. I remember a morning when I woke up and found Schmidt, one of the older men in our group, still sitting by the wall where he'd fallen asleep. I called his name, but he didn't move. His eyes were open, his body stiff, a thin layer of frost across his face. We buried him in the snow outside the factory. No one said a word. There were no words left. The Russians began to push harder. We could hear their tanks rumbling in the distance, their artillery pounding day and night. The sky was never still, always full of smoke, always trembling. The city that once promised glory now felt like a tomb. Then came the news. We were surrounded. It spread through the trenches and ruins like fire. The Soviets had cut us off completely. The Volga was no longer a line to reach. It was a wall of death. The Luftwaffe promised supplies, but the sky was thick with Soviet fighters. Most of the planes never made it through. We look up at the faint hum of engines, hoping to see parachutes dropping food, and watch them burn instead. By December, hope had turned into routine. We fought, not for victory, but because there was nothing else to do. Orders still came from headquarters. Hold the line. Reinforcements are coming. But we'd stopped believing them. You could see it in every face. The hollow eyes, the slow movements, the silence where laughter used to be. At night, I'd think about home, about my mother's kitchen, the smell of bread baking, my father sitting by the fire. I tried to remember their voices, but they felt like echoes from another life. Sometimes I'd pull out Muller's photo and stare at it, his wife and little boys smiling in the summer sun. I wondered if they still believed he was alive. One night, while I was on watch, I saw something move across the snow, a figure crawling. My rifle was already raised before I realized it was one of ours. A boy no older than 17, his face blue from the cold. He was missing a boot, his foot wrapped in rags. When I dragged him inside, he whispered, "I walked for 2 days." From the tractor factory. His unit was gone, wiped out. He asked me if we were winning. I didn't know what to say. I just told him to sleep. He didn't wake up the next morning. By Christmas, the city was silent, except for the wind. We tried to make a meal, melted snow and a few scraps of bread. One of the men hummed a carol under his breath, but stopped halfway through. None of us could finish it. Aside, the snow covered the bodies like a blanket. We told ourselves they looked peaceful that way. That night, I wrote another letter to my mother. I told her we were holding strong, that our spirits were high, I didn't tell her that I'd stopped believing in victory. Kaden, tell her that every sunrise felt like an accusation, a question of why I was still alive when so many others weren't. When I looked at the horizon, I could see faint flashes of artillery, the faint glow of the Soviet lines tightening around us. It felt like watching the walls of the world close in. For the first time, I wondered if God could even see this place anymore. We used to talk about honor, duty, and the fatherland. Now we talked about warmth, bread, and sleep. Victory had become a word from another language. And still, every morning, we picked up our rifles and faced the ruins. Because that's what soldiers do. We keep fighting, even when there's nothing left to fight for. By January, the city had turned into a cage. Every street we once fought to capture was now a corridor of ice and death. The snow had grown so deep that even the dead seemed to sink into it. Their helmets and boots poked through the white like markers in a graveyard no one had time to build. We were cut off completely. No supplies, no reinforcements, no hope. The sky that once brought the Luftwaffe now brought nothing but silence. When we saw planes at all, they were Russian strafing the ruins where we hid like rats. Command kept sending messages promising a breakthrough, but we knew better. The radios crackled with empty words and static. The encirclement had squeezed us into pockets of resistance. The factory district, the square, the silos. Each place became a miniature hell. You could smell death before you saw it. Frozen horses, broken men, the reek of oil and gunpowder that never left the air. We took shelter in a collapsed apartment block. There were 12 of us at first. By the end of the month, we were 5. I still remember the day we boiled our last horse. It had fallen weeks earlier, half buried under snow. We cut strips of frozen meat with bayonets, cooked them over a fire made from floorboards. No one spoke. The only sound was the wind moaning through the cracks in the walls. When I took the first bite, I almost cried, not because of the taste, but because it was warm. The faces of my comrades changed. Their eyes grew dull, their movements slow, mechanical. We spoke less each day. Words felt pointless now. The only thing that mattered was surviving one more sunrise. At night, the Russians broadcast messages through loudspeakers. They promised food, shelter, mercy if we surrendered. Some men listened too long. The next morning, we'd find them gone, vanished into the snow, leaving rifles behind. None ever returned. We told ourselves the Soviets had shot them, but deep down we knew they'd simply stopped fighting. One night, I was ordered to deliver a message to a nearby position, a warehouse turned command post. I crossed the ruins under a pale moon. The snow glowed like ash. Every step crunched like broken glass. When I reached the warehouse, I found only bodies frozen in place, rifles still in their hands. I didn't bother looking for the officer. There was no one left to give the message to. On the way back, I passed what used to be a streetcar line. The cars were half buried in snow, windows shattered. I heard movement inside and raised my rifle. A shape stumbled out. A German officer, his face thin, his uniform filthy. He looked at me and laughed. They told us we'd be in Moscow by Christmas, he said. His voice cracked. Now look at us. Then he walked away into the dark. I didn't follow. By mid-January, the Soviets had begun closing in from every direction. Their artillery never stopped. The ground trembled day and night. We dug ourselves deeper, burrowing like moles into the frozen earth. Sometimes When the shells hit close, the walls collapsed, burying men alive. You'd hear them screaming for a minute or two, then nothing. The hunger became worse than the cold. We ate anything candle wax, boiled leather, snow mixed with ash. Some men whispered about darker things I don't want to remember. I told myself I'd never sink that low, but in Stalingrad, every line you draw eventually blurs. One morning, I woke to find Weber sitting beside me, staring at nothing. His lips were blue, his hands shaking. He turned to me and said, "Do you still think we'll get out?" I didn't answer, so there was nothing to say. That day, the Soviets attacked again. Kiev fought from the ruins of a schoolhouse, firing through shattered windows. Kiev. I remember the chalkboard still hanging on the wall behind us. A child's lesson erased by soot. Numbers. A drawing of a sun. I thought of the boy who must have drawn it, and I wondered if he was out there now, aiming his rifle at me. The attack lasted 4 hours. When it ended, the ground outside was littered with bodies, ours and theirs. I walked among them, numb. I found Muller's photograph still in my coat pocket, edges torn, the faces smudged with dirt. I looked at it and felt nothing. That frightened me more than anything. That night, I wrote in my journal a few lines, barely legible from the cold. If anyone finds this, know that we fought because we were told to believe. But belief doesn't stop the snow. It doesn't stop the hunger. It only keeps you alive long enough to see what was real all along. The shelling started again before dawn. The roof caved in. We stumbled into the street, coughing through dust and smoke. The horizon burned orange as the Russians pushed closer. For the first time, I didn't run for cover. I just stood there, staring at the flames dancing across the ruins, thinking maybe this was what truth looked like. Not glory, not victory, it's fire and silence. By late January 1943, Stalingrad was no longer a battlefield, but a ruin sealed in ice. The German Sixth Army, once more than 250,000 men strong, had shrunk to scattered pockets clinging to cellars in shattered factories. Ammunition was measured in single rounds. Bread was measured in grams. The men who still stood were ghosts wrapped in rags, their faces hollow, their eyes dulled by frost and disbelief. From above, Soviet aircraft circled the city like carrion birds. On the ground, Red Army infantry closed in block by block, clearing each ruin with flamethrowers and grenades. What had once been a vast offensive was now a slow suffocation. Inside the German perimeter, officers tried to preserve discipline. Orders still came from the 4S headquarters holdout. Reinforcements will arrive. But the soldiers knew the truth. Radios hissed with static, and no help came. They buried the dead in snowbanks, marked graves with broken rifles, and waited. When the Soviet loudspeakers announced that General Paulus and his staff were surrounded in the city's heart, few were surprised. On the morning of the 31st of January, white flags began to appear among the ruins. By the 2nd of February, the last resistance had fallen silent. Those who emerged from the rubble were skeletal, wrapped in torn blankets, their hands raised. Soviet troops watched them in silence. Some of the captors had fought in the same streets for months. They looked not triumphant, but exhausted. Snow drifted between them as the wind carried away the smoke. The surrender did not feel like an ending, more like a release. For the soldiers who had believed in victory, the moment was empty, almost quiet. They were ordered into columns and marched toward the Volga, through a city of bones. Burned tanks jutted from the snow, their barrels crusted with frost. The smell of fuel and decay hung in the air. Witnesses later recalled that many of the prisoners did not speak. Few clutched photographs, medals, or letters that had survived the siege. Others stared straight ahead, as if still waiting for an order that would never come. In the weeks that followed, the Red Army cleared the last ruins, intended to the wounded friend and foe alike. The civilians who had survived emerged from cellars, pale and blinking at the light. They wandered through the wreckage of their own city, searching for names, for faces, for meaning, for the world beyond Stalingrad. The battle became a turning point. For those who had fought there, it remained a scar. The promise of victory had frozen with the river, leaving behind only the memory of what belief had cost. Among the ruins, someone found a small notebook. The handwriting was cramped and faded. The last entry, dated only days before the end, read, "We were told this city would be our triumph. Now it is our grave and our truth. I no longer believe in victory, only in the hope that someone will remember what happened here." When the guns at Stalingrad finally fell silent, winter still held its grip on the steppe. The wind that swept across the ruined city carried no sound of victory, only the slow groan of ice shifting on the river. The battle that had begun with speeches and flags ended in whispers and snow. Those who had survived captivity were marched eastward across endless plains. Some did not last a week. Others endured years in labor camps. A few returned home long after the war was over, older than their years and silent about what they had seen. Many never came back at all. Their names filled lists, their faces vanished into memory. For the Soviet soldiers who reclaimed the city, survival also brought a little peace. They buried the fallen friend and under the same frozen earth. Stalingrad was left a shell of brick and ash. Its streets, once mapped by pride and ambition, were now lined with wrecks and the rusting shapes of war. Yet, amid the devastation, life crept back. A train whistle months later, a market opening near the river, children playing where trenches had been. Decades would pass before the ruins were cleared and monuments rose. Veterans spoke of the battle with the same haunted caution, neither pride nor shame, only fatigue. Each side had believed it was fighting for something pure: duty, homeland, revenge, survival. But Stalingrad had stripped those words bare. Historians wrote of strategy and turning points, of armies and maps. Yet, behind every arrow drawn on a chart was a man who had once believed in victory. And what he found instead was a kind of truth that no triumph could erase, that war consumes belief until only endurance remains. One fragment of a diary found near the Volga years after the fighting carried a final line that outlived its author. "I came here believing we could shape history. Instead, history shaped us and left us to carry its weight in silence." For those who had stood in the frozen city, that silence became their lasting companion. Even now, when the wind moves across the river and the cranes wheel above the rebuilt skyline, there is a stillness that seems to remember. It is the echo of a generation who once believed they were invincible, till Stalingrad showed them the truth.